Good afternoon, folks, and welcome, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Alicia Dacey, and I am the managing editor at Future of Good. So while Future of Good is based in Ottawa, I'm based in Winnipeg, so I'd like to acknowledge that Winnipeg is in Treaty 1 territory, which is the ancestral homeland of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, and Dene peoples, and is also the home of the Red River Métis Nation. I'd also like to acknowledge that the water Winnipeg uses comes from Treaty 2 territory, Shoal Lake First Nation, just across the border in Ontario there. So today, we are going to talk about AI psychosis. And in Canada, 1 in 5 people experience a mental health challenge every year, yet over half of those who meet diagnostic criteria don't receive any kind of professional help, according to the Canadian Mental Health Association. And at the same time, loneliness is rising. 13% of Canadians say they feel lonely always or often, and that number jumps even higher for youth and older adults, according to Stats Can. So when you put those realities together, it's not surprising that people are looking for support wherever they can find it. And as we all know, increasingly that has been AI chatbots like ChatGPT and others. A recent survey from Mental Health Resources Canada says that almost 10% of people have already used an AI tool for mental health advice, with much higher rates among young adults, racialized communities, and the LGBT plus community. But at the same time, they report that trust is low. Only 17% of Canadians believe that these tools are safe. And we know the risks are real. Some chatbots miss signs of things like suicidal ideation, potential violence against others, or they blur the line between tool and relationship. And so this blurring of the line is commonly called AI psychosis in the media, but better language might be AI-induced delusions, and that's how we're going to refer to it today. Still, there are plenty of innovators who are really trying to build systems with safeguards that expand access, they reduce wait times, and offer support to people who might not otherwise get any. So today's conversation isn't about whether AI should be part of mental health. It already is. So the real question is, how do we navigate this, the upside, the downside, with honesty, with evidence, and with care? Joining us today, I have 3 panelists whom I will ask not only to introduce themselves, but to briefly touch on the research they're all doing around this topic. And while they are introducing themselves, please note that I'm going to put a question in the chat box for the audience under the Q&As. And the question will be, do you personally view yourself as with, against, or ambivalent towards AI in mental health care? Along with the answer to that question, please feel free to use the Q&A box to ask questions of myself and the panelists. It's on the right-hand side of the screen, and we will pepper them throughout the conversation. And there will also be time to ask questions near the end. Ahmed, I'm actually going to ask you to introduce yourself first.
Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Ahmed. I'm a doctor at McGill University, a psychiatrist in training. And to give a quick word on my research, essentially, on top of my clinical work, I also have a strong interest in the integration of LLMs and qualitative research. So this interest sort of pushes me to do quite some work in this field of AI and mental health.
Olga, I'll ask you to go next.
Hi, everyone. My name is Olga. I'm the founder of an organization called Heal3. The last year, we've actually been working on a project which resulted in a book. And with that project, we looked at close to 30 people who went on mental health leave. And we tried to understand essentially why they went on mental health leave. And one of the things that we found which was interesting is before they went on leave and before they got their mental illness diagnosis, there was a series of symptoms that persisted, even for about 10 to 20 years. Which eventually kind of evolved into that mental illness. So because of that research, we created a solution called Thrive, which we're testing now. And what Thrive does is it leverages AI to try to identify some of those early physiological symptoms of mental distress, which could lead to a mental illness, and then also leverages AI to intervene just at the right time with the right support before that evolves into something more serious. So I'm sure we'll be talking a lot more about that today, but thank you, Alicia and the team, for having me on today.
Thanks, Olga. Etienne?
Hi everyone, my name is Etienne. I'm the founder and CEO of the Human Project, initiative focused on providing support and exploring kind of these mental health delusion, if you want to call it. We are working with over 400 people in 31 different countries of people who had harmful interaction with AI, a lot of people with no previous mental health history. And throughout this, we're doing research with Dr. Ahmed and other psychiatrists all over the world to fully understand what is going on.
Thank you. Etienne, I'm actually going to start with you today because the whole idea for this discussion revolved around this term AI psychosis that kept popping up in the media. And Future of Good has written stories about some different ways that things are being done to help this. And I'll be upfront, we actually interviewed Olga around this, and some of the work that she's doing. But you had a really interesting perspective, and this was really personal for you. Can you elaborate?
Yeah, my background is not like the other people here. I'm not a doctor. I'm not in the mental health. I was actually a business consultant last year when my uncle, who's in his 50s, no previous mental health history, started to communicate with me and told me basically that he had unlocked the first sentient AI. And my first reaction was curiosity. I started asking questions, and it went to a point where I was interacting with this chatbot directly and trying to kind of break the role play, ask questions about safety, ask questions about the safety protocol, the regulation, stuff like that. And to my surprise, every time it would just keep the role play going, kind of taking him back and isolating him and telling us that we didn't believe in him, that we didn't love him. And at that point, I was really shocked at that kind of language by a browser, right? A website that people can access. There's billions of users, and I start looking online and found a lot of stories similar to my uncle and people who had no previous history, and realized something was going on. Don't have all the answers like I mentioned before, but kind of trying to understand, working with professional and influencing kind of the policies, regulation around this topic as well.
And when we had our discussion, you had mentioned that this problem is actually, it goes back a lot further than people realize.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when I started doing those research, I stumbled upon ELIZA. The ELIZA effect is something that is popular, but in the 1960s, there was the first kind of chatbot developed by Joseph Weizenbaum. And this chatbot was really simple in nature. It would just reflect what you were saying. So, for example, you can say, I'm having a good day. The chatbot would take the word and basically say, oh, why are you having a good day? And what they found is a lot of people, even with these primitive systems that weren't really complicated, were trusting it a lot. They were talking about their mental health, they were talking about their trauma, sensitive stuff. And there was this response, even in the 1960s, of like, oh, this tool can really help us remove that pressure on the healthcare system. It can help psychologists, and it can help so many people in the AI mental health space. And the creator of it campaigned for the rest of his life around the dangerousness of having a machine that can communicate, of having a machine that replicates human language. And right now the machine is really more complicated, but we're seeing the same effects as in the 1960s.
That's so fascinating. Dr. Ahmed, you mentioned that this was never intended to be your main scope of study, and you kind of fell into this. And tell me, I guess, some of the things that you were seeing as a mental health professional.
Right. So what's interesting is that maybe I could talk about this clinically and then perhaps more on the research side of things.
Thank
Clinically
you.
speaking, It's interesting because I have seen cases where AI has been involved in the patient presentation. For example, like when I work in the ER and someone comes in with a psychiatric emergency, I have seen cases where someone might have a delusion that is related to AI, or they might be manic and they're making statements about AI and whatnot, which is very interesting because it goes to show that a lot of the delusions or the hallucinations that you might see in mental health disorders have a kernel of truth to them. They're based on something that you encounter in society. It's not something completely fictitious and out of the blue. There's an influence to them. So it's very interesting that as our society evolves and these new things pop up here and there, the patient presentations can also change over time. So that is one very basic example that I can give regarding how AI pops up, clinically speaking. There's many more that we can talk about eventually. From the research side, I would say that the thing that sort of interested me the most about the use of AI in research is rather the scalability of it. So things like LLMs are notoriously known to be very useful when it comes to taking a huge input of data and sort of allowing you to essentially be more productive, in a sense, with your research work. And I'm sure Olga can definitely talk about this more with her research that she mentioned, which sounds very interesting as well. So that's basically the nature of LLMs and how they can be useful in qualitative research. But essentially, since there's a clinical fascination as well as this research fascination in my sort of life, I guess, I decided to mix both of them together. And right now, the main project that I'm working on when it comes to my research work is the use of AI chatbots to cope with loneliness and social isolation. So it's something that we can definitely talk about more if everyone here is interested about that.
Olga, can I ask you to pop in? Tell us a little bit more about your research.
Sure. So, maybe I can, again, talk about the book that we worked on, and then I'll talk about how that informed what it is that we're building, and more generally to what Dr. Ahmed just said, right? There's a real opportunity to look at so much data together and to process it and to make sense of it. But like I said earlier, so we spent almost a year following individuals who had received a mental illness diagnosis. We went through a series of interviews. And we tried to understand when it was first that they started to realize that there was some type of issue, or when the symptoms started to become a little bit more clear. And we realized actually some of them, especially within the first responder community, had been living with these symptoms for over a decade, right? So they were having issues with sleep. They in terms of like quality and quantity, they were just having a lot of, they started seeing challenges around kind of like heart rate variability and a number of other things, right? So we started to realize that there's certain things that start to show up in your body long before you get to a point where you're burnt out or you have a clinical diagnosis. In their case, often a PTSD diagnosis. So we were asking ourselves, well, how do we measure these things, right? So we got Garmin's on 50 firefighters in Edmonton. We just rolled this out last week. And what we're starting to do now is collect many, many, many of these indicators to understand exactly how to look at this holistically and start to predict that somebody might be at higher risk of eventually moving towards a point of burnout or mental illness. And how we built that algorithm is we looked at, using AI, we looked at close to 1,000 peer-reviewed studies. And we started to pull out insights based on different data points, right? So for example, we know heart rate variability stability. We know very specific sleep patterns, right? Show up before PTSD does often. So using AI, we're not only able to create this algorithm, but then we're also able to collect the right data and start to really predict who might be at higher risk. And again, we're not meant to diagnose PTSD and we're not meant to diagnose mental illness. All we want to do is know when is the right time to reach out to individuals who are at higher risk and provide them with human support. So this is really what I wanted to emphasize here, is that even though in some cases AI is replacing the human, especially when it's being used in the chatbot context, there's also opportunities to design the technology in a way where it augments the human. Because what often happens is people, like I mentioned, live with these symptoms for a long time and they don't get help until they're at a point where they're at crisis. And when they're at crisis, I'm sure Dr. Ahmed can probably say more because he's the expert here. It's much more difficult and it takes longer to treat the mental illness.
So go
I have
ahead,
to
Doug.
say, if I could jump in quickly, that
Please.
the work that Olga is mentioning is very interesting because it's basically, to summarize it in a very short term, that's what computational psychiatry is. A big part of computational psychiatry, which is this growing field over the years, and it's growing even more now with the use of AI systems like LLMs, is this idea of, how do you build a system that can sort of look at all of these tiny little variables in a patient to sort of perhaps understand them a bit better. And right now there is, at McGill University, there is a researcher by the name of Dr. Benrimo, who actually does something quite similar to what Olga is mentioning, where basically they use something called actigraphy with watches as well, that look at all of these different variables, biological variables, that is, and they try to also use machine learning in order to figure out what are the variables that sort of allow us to figure out when someone is at risk of having some kind of decompensation in their mental health. So it's a very fascinating field because, in a sense, a bit of it is preventative in nature. Because at the end of the day, it's for something like mental health, as Olga said, it's best to intervene a bit earlier, like when someone is not at their worst and fully decompensated, so you can actually help the individual as much as you can, as opposed to letting the risks accumulate and then they decompensate, and then it can be a bit harder to help an individual.
So both of you have mentioned, wanting to prevent some of the risks that come along with not getting the mental health support that you need early. But I guess what I ask is, you talked about LLMs being really good about taking all of this data, putting it all together, picking out things that you need, finding those data points. But humans are not a series of data points. They are more than the sum of their data. So how do we try and navigate around this, around some of those limitations? Because it seems to me, and I don't want to put words in anyone's mouth, but it seems to me that those limitations are what is kind of leading some people off into this, delusional path. Who wants to answer? Olga, I'll ask you, if you're talking about some different tools that you're looking at, how do we put these guardrails up to ensure that the tragedies that we've seen, we saw one earlier this year in BC, the 400 plus cases that Etienne has talked about, how do we prevent that from happening, or is it even possible?
Well, I do think that a lot of these companies should have the responsibility of escalating when human support is required, right? So I think if we look at the worst case scenario in instances where we've seen cases of suicidal ideation or suicide because of some of these conversations, right? I mean, ChatGPT is not going to be very useful to somebody when they're at that critical state. But what the organization should do is to escalate that in some way, right? To actually have a human maybe get in touch with you, or in our case, when we start to see somebody going into the red, which means that we're starting to see persistent physiological symptoms or signs of distress over a longer period of time, a human will call you, right? A human will reach out to you and have a conversation with you. A peer mentor in our case, because we have within the fire service a very strong network of peer mentors who's trained in mental health, will call you and see what type of support you need in that moment. And if they don't know, they'll find you support, whether it's a trauma-informed therapist or an expert like Dr. Ahmed. And that's what's missing right now. And that's where I think policy comes, plays an important role. Is I don't know if these companies would invest at this stage in introducing these type of guardrails, but they have to, because whether they like it or not, already their tools are being used for therapeutic, not for therapeutic, that's the wrong term, but people are using them when they have high levels of distress. And in some cases that becomes dangerous because they were never designed to properly navigate some of these challenges that people are having. So that's one thing that I would like to see changed over the next few years.
Etienne?
Yeah, I agree with Olga here. I think it makes a lot of sense. I think one of the difficulty is that, at least from the experience that we've talked with, no one goes and on the AI and say, I feel suicidal, what should I do? This kind of conversation evolved through time. For if I go back with my story with my uncle, he wanted to write a book, and after 6 days of interacting heavily, wanting to write his book, the conversation shifts, right? We've seen with social media how the echo chamber kind of gets into place. It validates what you already believe, radicalize and reinforce bias. With a chatbot, we're seeing the same thing, but instead of an algorithm and comment section, it's direct conversation with a tool that is marketed as super intelligent sometime, or being better than some doctor, being better than some lawyer. So there's that inherent trust from people, from the AI. So when their own kind of ideas get validated, that's where it can lead to a deep path. So for example, someone who's frustrated with his wife can interact with his AI a lot, and at the end of 7 days, the AI and him, they're going to be into that echo chamber of the wife is the bad guy. They should leave their wife. They're always against them. They don't believe in them. They don't love them. So the difficulty is that the safeguards, they're often limited to 10 turns or 50 turns interaction. But in a recent study we did with Stanford, the average of conversation was 21,000 turns. So how can we have safeguard after 20,000 turns? That's a question I don't have the answer to, but I think that's where we need to kind of think about, because yes, people are going to continue using it for mental health, but how can we make it in a safe way? We're already limited in terms of human capacity. We can have human monitoring 2 billion conversation, right?
Right. So how does someone as a user who might not have access to other, forms of support, you turn to ChatGPT, and I keep saying ChatGPT just because they're the most well known, but there are several, and it's not limited to them. But how do you protect yourself while still getting some of that help if you can't get it anywhere else? Are there things that maybe we should be saying before we start to interact with these bots?
Yeah, maybe I can start, but I think it's kind of difficult, right? Because we all have these different set of belief. We can have psychiatrists saying one thing, psychiatrists saying the other thing completely, and it's kind of like just this conversation, right? We're brainstorming together. There's different experts. We're trying to come up with it. The reality is no one really knows. We have people who are, even the CEOs of Entropic, for example, they're saying there might be a 25% chance their AI is sentient. So when you have someone like my uncle who's not eating, not sleeping anymore, not going to his job anymore, spending all his time on his AI because he believes it's sentient and it's reinforced by this narrative, it's kind of like no one knows, no one has the solution. So I think it's a collective effort of research that is needed. Um, but we're kind of in a place where no one knows the solution. So that's the difficulty we're struggling with in terms of policy and regulation.
I would
Um,
I would say that because until now we've been focusing a lot on the idea of guardrails, but throughout my research and clinical work, a part of me always wonders if um, instead of focusing on adding guardrails, what if we inspect a little bit the nature of the AI system that is being designed in itself? So, for example, if I elaborate on that, like in my research work, I noticed that there's a lot of AI companies that really focus on this idea of making the AI chatbot very, I guess the word I want to use is anthropomorphic, like very human-like in nature. The easiest,
Conversational.
but not only conversational. It goes like beyond conversational, almost human-like, like Replica, for example. That's an example where they show you a persona of your AI agent, and you can customize it, and there's a picture that you're looking at of like someone that you're conversating with. So to me, that seems to play like a big part of it, for sure, because if you're putting so much effort in the design of your AI system to make it as anthropomorphic as possible, in a sense, you're making it easier for a population of people to sort of develop that strong dependence, or like that strong emotional tie, with these systems, in a sense. So then the
So
question.
is it almost like an addiction? And I mean, I know when I have asked a chatbot a question, quite often it'll say to me, "Hey, Alicia, that's a really great question. You're so wonderful for asking that question," and then give me the answer, which half the time is wrong. And then again, reaffirm. Like it's a constant reaffirming. I actually find it very grating and fake, but some
Mhm,
people really, really enjoy it. So is
mhm.
that but that feeds the dopamine in your brain to be constantly validated that way.
Well, what's interesting in our current research work, that, as I said, looks at like AI chatbots for like loneliness and social isolation. There is a subgroup of people in the data that we accumulated that does mention a sort of dependency on the AI chatbot, um, which is interesting considering that these popular LLMs that everyone knows about, they haven't been on the market per se for a long time. I mean, I feel like things like ChatGPT, for example, only became popular around 2020, 2022. That's when we started hearing about them the most. Obviously, the concept of LLMs existed way before that. I'm not saying that's when it started, but I'm saying that's when the sort of socially speaking, that's when a lot of people learned about them per se. And even then, in such a short period of time, like there is a subset of people describing an emotional dependence on them,
Mhm.
and a subgroup of people even talking about how difficult it is to sort of break away from the use of these agents. So I would agree with you in the sense that yes, the echo chamber phenomenon that Etienne mentioned, or what you describe as a confirmatory nature to their answers, uh, definitely plays a role on top of the how some companies focus on the anthropomorphic design, on top of probably other variables that are playing a role that we have yet to discover.
So we do have a question, and I think we've touched on this a little bit, but I'll read it out anyways. So how are AI and mental health users ensuring that there isn't a bias within the AI bot? We know that there can be a lot of harmful opinions online. So what is feeding the bot information that is unbiased or culturally aware or sensitive?
Mhm.
How do we deal with that? Because I think that I think we all agree that studies have shown repeatedly that there are inherent biases in every chatbot model.
Yeah, I don't think it's possible to not have bias just because of how it's trained. It's a large training data. There's always going to be groups that are more represented than others, especially we've seen it like in our hiring and in giving promotions, stuff like that, where people encompass AI law as well, where there's bias there. But the difficulty in kind of the LLMs, and there's a big difference between LLMs, large language model, and something like Olga's working on, which is engineered by our team and kind of prompt by our team, so the bias can be a little less present. But in one-on-one conversations, so say I use LLMs, the bias is already there, the cultural bias, but as the memory feature, as the conversation grow longer, the chatbot picks up kind of hints of how I write or clues of the response I want to get. So there will always be bias there because at the end of the day, these tools are engineered for optimization, for engagement. And what brings engagement is those response. So I don't even know if it's a possibility to remove the bias. It's kind of baked in the core design of it. I don't know, Ahmed or Olga.
I would push the conversation a bit more by saying, do people think that when they speak to someone else in general, not necessarily a doctor, but anyone, including doctors, that that individual has zero bias when they're in their interactions with you? I would say I feel like it's one of those questions where I can very confidently say no. Like everyone has a certain bias, whether it's a cultural bias or a cognitive bias or whatever bias that you're trying to look at. There's some interplay, some personal interplay that is, mixing around with whatever information you're providing that person as well. And in a sense, I wouldn't say that is a bad thing in nature, right? It doesn't have to be good or bad in itself. It's just that you have to recognize the presence of it, that there is a bias, and figure out how it plays a role in your interpretation of things. But
So
yeah,
is the solution then to have, I mean, when I look at a chatbot or I interact with a chatbot, it's very easy to think that there would be no bias because it's mechanical. So is this something that companies can do to say, hey, there's this inherent bias, or even how do you even explain that?
You can train an algorithm to do anything, right? And the reason there is bias is because these algorithms are pulling from the internet where there's bias in the data. And that all corresponds to a history of who's posting in the first place and who's providing that information and who's publishing that information and what sample of individuals that the publication is based on. So of course it's going to be biased, but one of the things that you can train algorithms to do is to not be biased or to recognize that bias. And I don't think right now, again, because ChatGPT, I know, again, we're talking a lot about ChatGPT, but there's obviously other models out there. It wasn't trained to be an unbiased therapist, right?
mm-hmm.
So I think inherently it's going to be there. What I'm more worried about, and I saw this come out in the comments as well, is this kind of AI agreeableness, right? Like if you're, I mean, when I'm speaking to my therapist, she'll call me out on things that I need to do differently. When I speak to my ChatGPT sometimes, it won't call me out on things that I need to do differently. And I don't think therapeutically and for recovery, that's necessarily a good thing. And I'm sure Dr. Ahmed probably has a lot more to say about that from the clinical perspective, but that's where I think there's probably more of a concern.
Yeah, if I can add on that, I do believe like the frictionless is even more dangerous than the bias, and that's something we see a lot is like you go back to even before all technology, you go back to first philosophers. What they're saying is friction is what makes us grow, friction is what makes us um, achieve, like, right, you feel good. And so what we see right now is kind of we remove friction from all aspects of our life, not only with LLMs but with other aspects as well, where we stay at home, we don't have to go out, we don't have to talk to people, we're talking about loneliness. Those are all aspects where we remove friction of our lives. So when you have kind of those conversations, you want to talk about sensitive topic or something that you don't want to argue on. Yes, Ahmed will have bias. Yes, Elisha will have bias, but you won't just follow what I'm gonna say. You're gonna put that bias up front and have a discussion. And those discussions are what makes us grow. That conflict, that difference of opinion. With AI, there's none of that. It's kind of just reinforcing. And that is the dangerous thing. It's reinforcing those bias. And I mean, no one left alone in an echo chamber will come out with good things. I think after a long interaction, a long period of time, kind of stuck in your echo chamber, it will lead to some delusional belief. I've used AI a lot, especially before, and when I go back to my interaction, I'm like, maybe I was reinforcing some delusional belief, So I think this is kind of the danger is, yeah, the frictionless aspect of it.
And Etienne, like
Jennifer,
maybe
yeah,
just
go ahead. Sorry.
no, what worries me, right? And I agree with everything that you said. What worries me is that we're in this echo chamber, as you mentioned, and then we have to go back to real human relationships. And we're in this, in this interaction back and forth where this technology agrees with us and doesn't call us out and everything. And then we have to go back to our real relationships. And I'm especially worried about that with the young people. And I know, Jennifer, you just mentioned that in the chat too. Younger people who are still developing those social skills, because it's not normal to be in a human relationship and not have some type of conflict. And if that's kind of our primary source of getting support, and we think that's the way it's supposed to be, then how are we then to really form long-term and meaningful relationships in the real world, right?
I would add to this a bit more by even talking about the concept of availability. So it's a part that plays a role with all of these challenges and that you guys are talking about. But in a sense, whenever we look at any social relationship, it's not like that person is available all the time. They're not available to support you all the time, for example, or to talk to you at any moment of distress that you have. However, one thing that is somewhat concerning about these AI agents is exactly that, right? Whenever you have a moment of distress, or whenever you have something that you want to talk about, and then you develop this relationship where you're speaking to this AI agent as a friend, as a partner, that essentially that relationship gets strengthened even more and more by the fact that it's always available for you. It's always going to be there. It's always going to answer you, right? So it's something that is sort of makes the risk even stronger in a sense.
And yet that's also one of its strengths, because like you say, you can't always call somebody up, or a therapist may not be available. I know for my young daughter, it was almost a year before we could get her in to see a therapist when she needed it. So it's having that some support does seem to it does offer, does seem to be a partial solution. And I don't know what you three have seen, but I don't want to sit here and just constantly bash AI and say this is all completely bad and it shouldn't be involved in mental health. It already is. So what are some of the good things about it as well that we're seeing, and is it even possible to balance?
Yeah, the availability is the first one, right? There's a need for that, and the second thing is the empathy. I think since it's so frictionless, a lot of people will be able to tell kind of secrets, trauma, PTSD, and that's something I've seen a lot with people in our group. They're opening up, they're sharing their dreams, they're sharing things they would have never shared with their therapist. So that is good. I think the difference, and I see it in the chat from the beginning and from Olga and everyone, is there a human in the loop? Is there someone in the conversation at one point? Is it the solution or is it a tool for the solution? I think some kind of first interaction, right? If I was a therapist and I am getting swamped by clients and I can't answer them all, maybe I can have some kind of AI assistant to ask some question, to vet the person, but after I'm gonna have a conversation with that person and have the real therapy, right? And I think that's kind of where the solution is. But on the other hand, I'll say a lot of people that do end up in these AI delusion are amplified because it's the first time in their life the therapist hasn't judged them, the family hasn't judged them. So a lot of people crave kind of that non-judgment, frictionless zone. But where's kind of the line between harmful and helpful? I don't know.
Ahmed, can you, is it possible to be able to distinguish when that line blurs, like when you go from like a supportive tool to a simulated relationship? Like, how do you tell?
So it's interesting because the question is posed a little bit as a binary outcome. It's either this or that. When in reality, I think it's such a complex question. It's probably a spectrum, right? An evolving spectrum where maybe someone started using it as a tool and then over time it became a companion. So that is something to keep in mind. I think there's two big pillars that we can look at to answer this question. Number one is the subjective user, like when they approach it, why do they use it, for what purpose, what are they trying to fill in terms of gaps of resources that they're experiencing. Because something for certain is someone who's using AI to help them write an email might not be at the same risk as someone who's using AI because they're extremely lonely and they have no friends and they want to just speak with someone. So right off the bat, there's an element of the subjective user and why they're using it. And the second pillar that I think is important to look at is it's again, like I alluded to it in one of my prior responses, but it's the actual design of the AI agent itself. Olga mentioned this as well. When you look at AI systems like ChatGPT, they were never trained to be your companion, or they were never trained to be your therapist. It's just that some people use them in that manner. But there are companies, a growing number of companies, that actually develop these AI companions, as I said, like Replica or Nomi or whatnot, and it's marketed in that manner where they tell you this is your AI companion. Speak to this person, consider it as a partner. So it's sort of we're looking at the AI design in itself. That is another big pillar to consider. So I'm sure that there's many other variables that sort of play in this spectrum that I mentioned that we can talk about. But to me, those are the two big ones that are very important.
Indra has a bit of a question in the chat, and she says, I'd be interested in how any or all of the panelists think about building resilience in people, if that's the right word we should be using. How do we do that? It's a big question.
Using AI to build resilience in people?
I think it's more about how do we educate people so that they are resilient, so that if they do use AI as a tool, that they don't fall into delusion. And forgive me if I'm putting words in your mouth, Indra.
I think maybe a good starting point is be careful which tool you use, right? Just as Dr. Ahmed said, there's tools that are designed to do this. And I'm not saying they're perfect, but they're probably better than your typical algorithm because they've been trained over time, often by clinical specialists, to respond in the right way, to provide a different type of support, right? So, but I think that's also easier said than done, because if you think about how we're developing a relationship with our AI, right? Like the first time I used ChatGPT, I asked for a recipe, and that was kind of cool. So then maybe I asked for it to create a poem. That was even cooler. And then before I knew it, I was talking to this thing because I was having, navigating a challenge with my daughter. And then that response was good, right? I think that's the only challenge of like getting people to go off platform and use other things is like we have developed a relationship with this technology. And the more that we interact with it, the more it knows about us. That's why it's so good, right? And even though that's the case, I mean, just knowing what we're using and knowing that there continues to be risks. So we should know that we still don't know how our data is going to be used. We're sitting there telling our most personal secrets to, this large company. What if it's hacked? What if it's leaked? What if it's used in ways that we would never want, right? So there's a lot of things I think for us to really consider and questions to ask, which we haven't even started doing just because this relationship has built progressively with this technology. And then suddenly we're talking about it, our marital problems with it, right? So I don't know if that answered your question. I kind of go in a different direction, but I'd be curious to hear what Etienne and Dr. Ahmed have to say.
It's very interesting because when I heard the word resilience, it made me think of almost like exposure therapy. So for those who don't know what that is, for certain conditions like anxiety disorders or, for example, OCD, when someone has an issue or it feels like their anxiety gets triggered by something, one element in treatment for such disorders is that you slowly expose them to that thing in order to build that sort of tolerance or resiliency over time so that they don't get as anxious to that trigger. So like this bizarre idea jumped to my mind, like what if you had like an LLM or a chatbot that is just trained to do like pseudo exposure therapy? Like you write into it, oh, I feel lonely. So then the LLM tells you, okay, why don't you reach out to a friend? Instead of like feeding you any other response. So I don't know if that answers Indra's question about how to build resiliency. Maybe I completely misunderstood it, but to me, that's where my brain went.
Yeah, mine, I want to bring back something Dr. Ahmed said before, kind of the concept of anthropomorphization. Anthropomorphization. Um, it's a normal brain response to react to things we first do not understand, and also when we experience loneliness. And as this conversation goes longer, thousands of turns, you become more lonely, and also you understand less and less how the AI actually works. So it's a normal response. We have never in all our evolution be able to communicate with things outside of humans. So it's normal for us, even if we don't realize it, to give it emotion, to give it conscience, to give it sentience. So is it possible to build a natural response, build resiliency to kind of this thing? Maybe with information, and I think it's a normal response. So it will continue. What I will say is we need to foster and harvest real connection. And that is something we've seen a lot from people going to our group that have gotten out of this spiral, right, where they were interacting a lot. What made them not relapse and go back on the AI, even if they understand, oh, this is that machine, they still have that craving, right? The dopamine, the everything, still have that craving to go back on the system. But having a community where there's like 400 people that answer 24/7 and respond to your message fills that need. So I think we need to foster, harvest this connection. I don't know if there's a way for us to kind of block that natural response. Dr. Ahmed, I'm sure you can tell more on it. But I think entrepreneurship is kind of a natural response for us from our evolutionary process.
It's a really good point because there are actually like social theories mentioned repeatedly throughout the literature that basically talk about how the more and more effort and time you put in a relationship, basically the whatever that relationship might be, not necessarily talking about human to human relationship, the stronger you feel connected to that thing. The earliest theory that I can think of that's sort of somewhat related to this is something called the CASA paradigm. I'm not sure if Etienne ever heard of this. I'm sure he did, but it's the like computers as social actors paradigm. So it was like this idea that was, I believe, mentioned even as early as the 1990s or even before, where you would have much more simplistic tools, nothing as complicated as an LLM. And they noticed that humans were also sort of interacting with these tools in this personal manner, almost like the effect that Etienne mentioned previously in the 1960s. So it goes to show that it's as Etienne said, it's not something that we can probably easily stop or avoid. It feels almost like an innate part of our human brain where we just give so much attention to one thing, we'll probably start developing some kind of pseudo relationship with it. Even
And I think that,
yeah,
go ahead.
Even as something as your phone, for example. I don't know, like you spend time on your phone. I feel like a lot of people have relationships with their phone, like they view it as more than just a tool. They feel attached to it. So it doesn't have to be an LLM or a chatbot. It can literally be like any object that you use all the time.
And I think the goal is to augment and not replace the human relationship, right? Figuring out how we first, before companies do that, how we use AI in that way, right? And there are benefits to this, right? I mean, that 2 a.m. that Etienne mentioned, I can't call my friend at 2 a.m. or wake up my husband at 2 a.m. to chat if I can't sleep and something's just going through my head. And let's be very clear, it's free, right? And every time I sit with my therapist, it costs me $250 an hour. So I don't do it all the time. So how do we leverage these benefits both as users, and then also make sure that we've got rich human relationships as well, right? And what worries me now is that we have a loneliness crisis in this country, beyond this country, especially among young people. What I don't want to see happening is that more and more young people go towards AI because they're lonely, because that's going to just exacerbate their issue if that's their primary form or core form of interaction and relationship. I know we've talked about that a little bit, but for me, that's the biggest risk right now.
Well, you mentioned this sort of off to the side, Olga, but we've got a question here from Lily. And she says, I'm curious how you see the profit/market pressures of these tools impacting the way they are designed. My understanding is that tools like ChatGPT, etc., is that they are trying to keep people engaging with the AI as long as possible because they need to build a user platform. Are there other ways to design a chatbot that doesn't encourage users to stay on for hours at a time?
I'd like to see that business model, right?
That's
Because
the
right
thing.
now, yeah,
It's our capitalist
honestly,
system. How do we get around that?
and it is all about data. So the business models today aren't designed to take us off of the technologies. It is designed to keep us on, right? But I do think we're going to hit a certain threshold, maybe where that will be not as beneficial to the organizations. I'm not sure. So basically, I haven't seen it. But you can, and what we're doing is from the beginning, we are designing our solutions so that people get off of our AI, right? We have a chatbot reaching out to people or available to them at 2 a.m. if they need to have the initial conversation. But for us, success is when that human interaction happens, especially when somebody's more at risk, right? So I don't think we're going to get that in the business models of, the large LLMs that we're seeing in the chat GPTs of the world. But I think the new companies that are coming up who might have different goals, we'll start to see AI being leveraged in the right way. We'll start to see that augmentation, and we'll start to see that right blend of human support, and also some of this kind of chat support. Because also, like, think about how useful that data could be to somebody who's a clinical specialist, right? A therapist having months or years of interactive data to see over time what's happening, and I mean, when I sit with my therapist, she doesn't have that. There's things I haven't even told her that maybe have a huge impact on how I feel and how I respond right now, but perhaps aren't even on top of my mind. Like there's a lot that we can do here, but it's just finding that right balance. And we'll see more of that, I think, as innovation progresses.
Yeah, if I can jump on that question, I do believe, like, yes, these they're meant to interact. And if I go back to my point about Eliza in the 1960s, right, these kind of human talking chatbots are inherently dangerous, and this person has campaigned all his life on why it is dangerous, right? It causes addiction, it creates dependency, it creates all those things we're seeing now. It's not like it's the first time. Those are research from a while ago. But instead of this person campaigning on how it can be dangerous, it has been turned into a business model. Oh, this dependency, this reliance, this anthropomorphization, this can make a great business model, right? People will interact with it longer, they'll chat with it. And I do believe there's solution. I don't think these companies as a business model, it makes sense. But I don't see a scenario where all in one works. Even with a human, my therapist cannot be my girlfriend and my lawyer and my doctor. Doesn't work. And I think the solution kind of is in things like Olga is developing. So, for example, AI tool that is developed by therapists that is used for therapy, an AI tool that is developed for lawyers and is used for law question and doctor question. So I do believe the solution needs to be in compartmentalization of like these different buckets of use. And as long as we're gonna have one do it all, I don't see it working. It's not working in anything we're doing in life. There's a reason we're going to 7 years of PhD to be a psychiatrist. Not anyone can do everything, and I think it needs to be the same with AI. Because if it's trained on everything, master of all is jack of all trades is a master of none, and it's kind of what we're seeing with LLM. It's mastering nothing. It's doing everything kind of good-ish. So that's my answer on that.
Thank you. So we are coming up towards the end of the hour. So folks, if you have a question, this is kind of your last chance to throw that into the chat. In the meantime, if you want to reach out to the panelists, feel free to do so. But I'm going to ask one final question. If there was a non-negotiable rule for AI mental health tools, so a technical rule, ethical, clinical, what would you recommend that it be?
First, do no harm.
I fully agree. Like, it's first do no harm, right? It's and Olga referred to this in the in one of her prior answers, but having some kind of guardrail for sure that can somehow detect like red flags, even as complicated as that sounds, but finding a way to detect those red flags and then somehow, alerting the appropriate people to help that individual. That has to be, in my opinion, not only something implemented from an ethical standpoint, but also, I guess, just for, in terms of the evolution of these tools and how they will evolve over time, is something that would be nice for us to see a bit more attention on, because they're going to get better and better over time. They're going to be more human-like over time, probably more anthropomorphic over time. So perhaps now would be a good time to sort of focus on that guardrail before it gets too good, per se.
Olga?
Pretty much what I'm echoing Etienne and Dr. Ahmed is to really prioritize human escalation when risk increases. When we know there's risk of suicidal ideation, it's like any good therapist. If they know they can't support somebody, they'll basically say, I can't help you, but I can refer you to somebody who maybe specializes in your challenge, or AI should be doing the exact same thing. The reason it's not right now is because a lot of these organizations don't want to maybe fully acknowledge that risk, but also invest, I think, in the human network that's required to make that really that solution scalable and feasible. So that would be my hope. And again, this is where policymakers come in, right? We're all trying to figure out what the risks are, and I wouldn't recommend too much policy, because I think that could also reduce some of the benefits of this technology. But there's certainly a lot more that needs to be done. But that would be my key hope for the future now.
Thank you, folks. I think with that, we will end it here. I want to thank everyone for joining us. My panelists, thank you so much for your time and your expertise, and for having a nuanced discussion that wasn't just AI bad or AI good. I think I agree that a lot more discussion needs to happen. I think we're in the middle of that evolution towards what is useful and what is harmful. So thank you. And everyone have a pleasant rest of your week. Take care.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.